Early in the autumn of 1826, the Abbé Birato, the principal personage of this history, was overtaken by a shower of rain as he returned home from a friend's house, where he had been passing the evening. He therefore crossed, as quickly as his corpulence would allow, the deserted little square called the Cloister, which lies directly behind the chancel of the Cathedral of Saint Gatien at Tours. The Abbé Birato, a short little man, apoplectic in constitution and about 60 years old, had already gone through several attacks of gout. Now, among the petty miseries of human life, the one for which the worthy priest felt the deepest aversion was the sudden sprinkling of his shoes, adorned with silver buckles, and the wetting of their soles. Notwithstanding the woolen socks in which at all seasons he enveloped his feet with the extreme care that ecclesiastics take of themselves, he was apt at such times to get them a little damp, and the next day gout was sure to give him certain infallible proofs of constancy. Nevertheless, as the pavement of the cloister was likely to be dry, and as the abbé had won 3 francs 10 sous in his rubber with Madame de Listomere, he bore the rain resignedly from the middle of the Place de l'Archevêché, where it began to come down in earnest. Besides, he was fondling his chimera, a desire already 12 years old, the desire of a priest, a desire formed anew every evening and now apparently very near accomplishment. In short, he had wrapped himself so completely in the fur cape of a canon that he did not feel the inclemency of the weather. During the evening, several of the company who habitually gathered at Madame de Listomere's had almost guaranteed to him his nomination to the office of canon, then vacant in the metropolitan chapter of Saint Gatien, assuring him that no one deserved such promotion as he, whose rights, long overlooked, were indisputable. If he had lost the rubber, if he had heard that his rival, the Abbé Poirel, was named canon, the worthy man would have thought the rain extremely chilling. He might even have thought ill of life. But it so chanced that he was in one of those rare moments when happy inward sensations make a man oblivious of discomfort. In hastening his steps he obeyed a more mechanical impulse, and truth, so essential in a history of manners and morals, compels us to say that he was thinking of neither rain nor gout. In former days there was in the cloister, on the side towards the Grand Rue, a cluster of houses forming a close and belonging to the cathedral, where several of the dignitaries of the chapter lived. After the confiscation of ecclesiastical property, the town had turned the passage through this close into a narrow street, called the Rue de la Salette, by which pedestrians passed from the cloister to the Grand Rue. The name of this street proves clearly enough that the precentor and his pupils and those connected with the choir formerly lived there. The other side, the left side, of the street is occupied by a single house, the walls of which are overshadowed by the buttresses of Saint Gatien, which have their base in the narrow little garden of the house, leaving it doubtful whether the cathedral was built before or after this venerable dwelling. An archaeologist examining the arabesques, the shape of the windows, the arch of the door, the whole exterior of the house, now mellow with age, would see at once that it had always been a part of the magnificent edifice with which it is blended. An antiquary, had there been one at Tours, one of the least literary towns in all France, would even discover, where the narrow street enters the cloister, several vestiges of an old arcade, which formerly made a portico to these ecclesiastical dwellings, and was, no doubt, harmonious in style with the general character of the architecture. The house of which we speak, standing on the north side of the cathedral, was always in the shadow thrown by that vast edifice, on which time had cast its dingy mantle, marked its furrows, and shed its chill humidity, its lichen, mosses, and rank herbs. The darkened dwelling was wrapped in silence, broken only by the bells, by the chanting of the offices heard through the windows of the church, by the call of the jackdaws nesting in the belfries. The region is a desert of stones, a solitude with a character of its own, an arid spot, which could only be inhabited by beings who had either attained to absolute nullity, or were gifted with some abnormal strength of soul. The house in question had always been occupied by abbés, and it belonged to an old maid named Mademoiselle Gamard. Though the property had been bought from the national domain under the Reign of Terror by the father of Mademoiselle Gamard, no one objected under the Restoration to the old maid's retaining it, because she took priests to board and was very devout. It may be that religious persons gave her credit for the intention of leaving the property to the chapter. The Abbé Berato was making his way to this house, where he had lived for the last 2 years. His apartment had been, as was now the canonry, an object of envy and his hocerat in votis for a dozen years. To be Mademoiselle Gamard's boarder and to become a canon were the two great desires of his life. In fact, they do present accurately the ambition of a priest, who, considering himself on the high road to eternity, can wish for nothing in this world but good lodging, good food, clean garments, shoes with silver buckles, a sufficiency of things for the needs of the animal, and a canonry to satisfy self-love, that inexpressible sentiment which follows us, they say, into the presence of God, for there are grades among the saints. But the covetous desire for the apartment which the Abbé Berato was now inhabiting, a very harmless desire in the eyes of worldly people, had been to the Abbé nothing less than a passion full of obstacles, and, like more guilty passions, full of hopes, pleasures, and remorse. The interior arrangements of the house did not allow Mademoiselle Gamard to take more than 2 lodgers. Now, for about 12 years before the day when Berato went to live with her, she had undertaken to keep in health and contentment 2 priests, namely, Monsieur l'Abbé Trubert and Monsieur l'Abbé Chapelaud. The Abbé Trubert still lived. The Abbé Chapelaud was dead, and Berato had stepped into his place. The late Abbé Chapelaud, in life a canon of Saint Gatien, had been an intimate friend of the Abbé Berato. Every time that the latter paid a visit to the canon, he had constantly admired the apartment, the furniture, and the library. Out of this admiration grew the desire to possess these beautiful things. It had been impossible for the Abbé Berato to stifle this desire, though it often made him suffer terribly when he reflected that the death of his best friend could alone satisfy his secret covetousness, which increased as time went on. The Abbé Chapelaud and his friend Berato were not rich. Both were sons of peasants, and their slender savings had been spent in the mere costs of living during the disastrous years of the Revolution, when Napoleon restored the Catholic worship. The Abbé Chapelaud was appointed canon of the cathedral and Berato was made vicar of it. Chapelaud then went to board with Mademoiselle Gamard. When Birato first came to visit his friend, he thought the arrangement of the rooms excellent, but he noticed nothing more. The outset of this concupiscence of chattels was very like that of a true passion, which often begins, in a young man, with cold admiration for a woman whom he ends in loving forever. The apartment, reached by a stone staircase, was on the side of the house that faced south. The Abbé Tribert occupied the ground floor, and Mademoiselle Gamard the first floor of the main building, looking on the street. When Chapelaud took possession of his rooms, they were bare of furniture, and the ceilings were blackened with smoke. The stone mantelpieces, which were very badly cut, had never been painted. At first, the only furniture the poor canon could put in was a bed, a table, a few chairs, and the books he possessed. The apartment was like a beautiful woman in rags. But 2 or 3 years later, an old lady having left the Abbé Chapelaud 2,000 francs, he spent that sum on the purchase of an oak bookcase, the relic of a chateau pulled down by the Bande Noire, the carving of which deserved the admiration of all artists. The Abbé made the purchase less because it was very cheap than because the dimensions of the bookcase exactly fitted the space it was to fill in his gallery. His savings enabled him to renovate the whole gallery, which up to this time had been neglected and shabby. The floor was carefully waxed, the ceiling whitened, the woodwork painted to resemble the grain and knots of oak. A long table in ebony and 2 cabinets by Boule completed the decoration, and gave to this gallery a certain air that was full of character. In the course of 2 years, the liberality of devout persons and legacies, those small ones, from pious penitents, filled the shelves of the bookcase, till then half empty. Moreover, Chapelaud's uncle, an old Oratorian, had left him his collection in folio of the Fathers of the Church, and several other important works that were precious to a priest. Birato, more and more surprised by the successive improvements of the gallery, once so bare, came by degrees to a condition of involuntary envy. He wished he could possess that apartment, so thoroughly in keeping with the gravity of ecclesiastical life. The passion increased from day to day, working, sometimes, for days together. In this retreat, the vicar could appreciate the silence and the peace that reigned there. During the following year, the Abbé Chapelaud turned a small room into an oratory, which his pious friends took pleasure in beautifying. Still later, another lady gave the canon a set of furniture for his bedroom, the covering of which she had embroidered under the eyes of the worthy man without his ever suspecting its destination. The bedroom then had the same effect upon the vicar that the gallery had long had. It dazzled him. Lastly, about 3 years before the Abbé Chapelaud's death, he completed the comfort of his apartment by decorating the salon, though the furniture was plainly covered in red Utrecht velvet. It fascinated Birato. From the day when the canon's friend first laid eyes on the red damask curtains, the mahogany furniture, the Aubusson carpet which adorned the vast room, then lately painted, his envy of Chapelaud's apartment became a monomania hidden within his breast. To live there, to sleep in that bed with the silk curtains where the canon slept, to have all Chapelaud's comforts about him, would be, Birato felt, complete happiness. He saw nothing beyond it. all the envy, all the ambition which the things of this world give birth to in the hearts of other men concentrated themselves for Berato in the deep and secret longing he felt for an apartment like that which the Abbé Chapelaud had created for himself. When his friend fell ill, he went to him out of true affection, but all the same, when he first heard of his illness, and when he sat by his bed to keep him company, there arose in the depths of his consciousness, in spite of himself, a crowd of thoughts, the simple formula of which was always, if Chapelaud dies, I can have this apartment. And yet, Berato, having an excellent heart, contracted ideas, and a limited mind, he did not go so far as to think of means by which to make his friend bequeath to him the library and the furniture. The Abbé Chapelaud, an amiable, indulgent egoist, fathomed his friends' desires, not a difficult thing to do, and forgave them, which may seem less easy to a priest, but it must be remembered that the vicar, whose friendship was faithful, did not fail to take a daily walk with his friend along their usual pathing the Vicar of Tours, never once depriving him of an instant of the time devoted for over 20 years to that exercise. Berato, who regarded his secret wishes as crimes, would have been capable, out of contrition, of the utmost devotion to his friend. The latter paid his debt of gratitude for a friendship so ingenuously sincere by saying, a few days before his death, as the vicar sat by him reading the quotidian aloud, "This time you will certainly get the apartment. I feel it is all over with me now." Accordingly, it was found that the Abbé Chapelaud had left his library and all his furniture to his friend Berato. The possession of these things, so keenly desired, and the prospect of being taken to board by Mademoiselle Gamard, certainly did allay the grief which Berato felt at the death of his friend the canon. He might not have been willing to resuscitate him, but he mourned him. For several days he was like Gargantus, who, when his wife died in giving birth to Pantagruel, did not know whether to rejoice at the birth of a son or grieve at having buried his good Babette, and therefore cheated himself by rejoicing at the death of his wife, and deploring the advent of Pantagruel. The Abbé Berato spent the first days of his mourning in verifying the books in his library, in making use of his furniture, in examining the whole of his inheritance, saying in a tone which, unfortunately, was not noted at the time, "Poor Chapelaud." His joy and his grief so completely absorbed him that he felt no pain when he found that the office of canon, in which the late Chapelaud had hoped his friend Berato might succeed him, was given to another. Mademoiselle Gamard having cheerfully agreed to take the vicar to board, the latter was thenceforth a participator in all those felicities of material comfort of which the deceased canon had been wont to boast. Incalculable they were. According to the Abbé Chapelaud, none of the priests who inhabited the city of Tours, not even the archbishop, had ever been the object of such minute and delicate attentions as those bestowed by Mademoiselle Gamard on her two lodgers. The first words the canon said to his friend when they met for their walk on the Mail referred usually to the succulent dinner he had just eaten, and it was a very rare thing if during the walks of each week he did not say, at least 14 times, that excellent spinster certainly has a vocation for serving ecclesiastics. Just think, the canon would say to Berato, that for 12 consecutive years nothing has ever been amiss, linen in perfect order, bands, albs, surplices. I find everything in its place, always in sufficient quantity, and smelling of orris root. My furniture is rubbed and kept so bright that I don't know when I have seen any dust. Did you ever see a speck of it in my rooms? Then the firewood is so well selected. The least little things are excellent. In fact, Mademoiselle Gamard keeps an incessant watch over my wants. I can't remember having rung twice for anything, no matter what, in 10 years. That's what I call living. I never have to look for a single thing, not even my slippers. Always a good fire, always a good dinner. Once the bellows annoyed me, the nozzle was choked up, but I only mentioned it once, and the next day Mademoiselle gave me a very pretty pair, also. Those nice tongs you see me mend the fire with. For all answer Birato would say, smelling of orris root. That smelling of orris root always affected him. The canon's remarks revealed ideal joys to the poor vicar, whose bands and alps were the plague of his life, for he was totally devoid of method and often forgot to order his dinner. Therefore, if he saw Mademoiselle Gamard at Saint Gatien while saying Mass or taking round the plate, he never failed to give her a kindly and benevolent look, such a look as Saint Teresa might have cast to heaven. Though the comforts which all creatures desire, and for which he had so often longed, thus fell to his share, the Abbé Birato, like the rest of the world, found it difficult, even for a priest, to live without something to hanker for. Consequently, for the last 18 months he had replaced his too satisfied passions by an ardent longing for a canonry. The title of canon had become to him very much what a peerage is to a plebeian minister. The prospect of an appointment, hopes of which had just been held out to him at Madame de Listomere's, so completely turned his head that he did not observe until he reached his own door that he had left his umbrella behind him. Perhaps, even then, if the rain were not falling in torrents he might not have missed it, so absorbed was he in the pleasure of going over and over in his mind what had been said to him on the subject of his promotion by the company at Madame de Listomere's, an old lady with whom he spent every Wednesday evening. The vicar rang loudly, as if to let the servant know she was not to keep him waiting. Then he stood close to the door to avoid, if he could, getting showered. But the drip from the roof fell precisely on the toes of his shoes, and the wind blew gusts of rain into his face that were much like a shower bath. Having calculated the time necessary for the woman to leave the kitchen and pull the string of the outer door, he rang again, this time in a manner that resulted in a very significant peal of the bell. They can't be out, he said to himself, not hearing any movement on the premises. Again he rang, producing a sound that echoed sharply through the house and was taken up and repeated by all the echoes of the cathedral, so that no one could avoid waking up at the remonstrating racket. Accordingly, in a few moments, he heard, not without some pleasure in his wrath, the wooden shoes of the servant woman clacking along the paved path which led to the outer door. But even then, the discomforts of the gouty old gentleman were not so quickly over as he hoped. Instead of pulling the string, Marianne was obliged to turn the lock of the door with its heavy key, and pull back all the bolts. "Why did you let me ring 3 times in such weather?" said the vicar. "But, monsieur, don't you see the door was locked? We have all been in bed ever so long. It struck 11:15 some time ago. Mademoiselle must have thought you were in. You saw me go out, yourself. Besides, Mademoiselle knows very well I always go to Madame de Listomere's on Wednesday evening. I only did as Mademoiselle told me, monsieur. These words struck the vicar a blow, which he felt the more because his late reverie had made him completely happy. He said nothing and followed Marianne towards the kitchen to get his candlestick, which he supposed had been left there, as usual. But instead of entering the kitchen, Marianne went on to his own apartments, and there the vicar beheld his candlestick on a table close to the door of the red salon, in a sort of antechamber formed by the landing of the staircase, which the late canon had enclosed with a glass partition. Mute with amazement, he entered his bedroom hastily, found no fire, and called to Marianne, who had not had time to get downstairs. You have not lighted the fire, he said. Beg pardon, Monsieur l'Abbé. I did, she said. It must have gone out. Birato looked again at the hearth, and felt convinced that the fire had been out since morning. I must dry my feet, he said. Make the fire. Marianne obeyed with the haste of a person who wants to get back to her night's rest. While looking about him for his slippers, which were not in the middle of his bedside carpet as usual, the abbé took mental notes of the state of Marianne's dress, which convinced him that she had not got out of bed to open the door as she said she had. He then recollected that for the last 2 weeks he had been deprived of various little attentions which for 18 months had made life sweet to him. Now, as the nature of narrow minds induces them to study trifles, Birato plunged suddenly into deep meditation on these 4 circumstances, imperceptible in their meaning to others, but to him indicative of 4 catastrophes. The total loss of his happiness was evidently foreshadowed in the neglect to place his slippers, in Marianne's falsehood about the fire, in the unusual removal of his candlestick to the table of the antechamber, and in the evident intention to keep him waiting in the rain. When the fire was burning on the hearth, and the lamp was lighted, and Marianne had departed without saying, as usual, "Does monsieur want anything more?" the Abbé Birato let himself fall gently into the wide and handsome easy chair of his late friend, but there was something mournful in the movement with which he dropped upon it. The good soul was crushed by a presentiment of coming calamity. His eyes roved successively to the handsome tall clock, the bureau, curtains, chairs, carpets, to the stately bed, the basin of holy water, the crucifix, to a Virgin by Valentine, a Christ by Lebrun, in short, to all the accessories of this cherished room, while his face expressed the anguish of the tenderest farewell that a lover ever took of his first mistress, or an old man of his lately planted trees. The vicar had just perceived, somewhat late it is true, the signs of a dumb persecution instituted against him for the last 3 months by Mademoiselle Gamard, whose evil intentions would doubtless have been fathomed much sooner by a more intelligent man. Old maids have a special talent for accentuating the words and actions which their dislike suggests to them. They scratch like cats. They not only wound, but they take pleasure in wounding, and in making their victims see that he is wounded. A man of the world would never have allowed himself to be scratched twice. The good abbé, on the contrary, had taken several blows from those sharp claws before he could be brought to believe in any evil intention. But when he did perceive it, he set to work, with the inquisitorial sagacity which priests acquire by directing consciences and burrowing into the nothings of the confessional, to establish, as though it were a matter of religious controversy, the following proposition, admitting that Mademoiselle Gamard did not remember it was Madame de Listomere's evening, and that Marianne did think I was home, and did really forget to make my fire, it is impossible, inasmuch as I myself took down my candlestick this morning, that Mademoiselle Gamard, seeing it in her salon, could have supposed I had gone to bed. Ergo, Mademoiselle Gamard intended that I should stand out in the rain, and, by carrying my candlestick upstairs, she meant to make me understand it. What does it all mean? He said aloud, roused by the gravity of these circumstances, and rising as he spoke. To take off his damp clothes, get into his dressing gown, and do up his head for the night. Then he returned from the bed to the fireplace, gesticulating, and launching forth in various tones the following sentences, all of which ended in a high falsetto key, like notes of interjection. What the deuce have I done to her? Why is she angry with me? Marianne did not forget my fire. Mademoiselle told her not to light it. I must be a child if I can't see, from the tone and manner she has been taking to me, that I've done something to displease her. Nothing like it ever happened to Chapelloud. I can't live in the midst of such torments as, at my age. He went to bed hoping that the morrow might enlighten him on the causes of the dislike which threatened to destroy forever the happiness he had now enjoyed. 2 years after wishing for it so long. Alas! The secret reasons for the inimical feelings Mademoiselle Gamard bore to the luckless Abbé were fated to remain eternally unknown to him, not that they were difficult to fathom, but simply because he lacked the good faith and candor by which great souls and scoundrels look within and judge themselves. A man of genius or a trickster says to himself, I did wrong. Self-interest and native talent are the only infallible and lucid guides. Now the Abbé Birotteau, whose goodness amounted to stupidity, whose knowledge was only, as it were, plastered on him by dint of study, who had no experience whatever of the world and its ways, who lived between the Mass and the confessional, chiefly occupied in dealing the most trivial matters of conscience. In his capacity of confessor to all the schools in town and to a few noble souls who rightly appreciated him, the Abbé Birotteau must be regarded as a great child, to whom most of the practices of social life were utterly unknown. And yet, the natural selfishness of all human beings, reinforced by the selfishness peculiar to the priesthood and that of the narrow life of the provinces, had insensibly, and unknown to himself, developed within him. If anyone had felt enough interest in the good man to probe his spirit and prove to him that in the numerous petty details of his life and in the minute duties of his daily existence he was essentially lacking in the self-sacrifice he professed, he would have punished and mortified himself in good faith. But those whom we offend by such unconscious selfishness pay little heed to our real innocence. What they want is vengeance, and they take it. Thus it happened that Birotteau, weak brother that he was made to undergo the decrees of that great distributive justice which goes about compelling the world to execute its judgments, called by ninnies the misfortunes of life. There was this difference between the late Chapelloud and the vicar: one was a shrewd and clever egoist, the other a simple-minded and clumsy one. When The canon went to board with Mademoiselle Gamard. He knew exactly how to judge of his landlady's character. The confessional had taught him to understand the